Chairman, that's a bit rich. That's a bit rich from that member talking about policies, the gap opening up between Australia and New Zealand. When did that gap open up? It was when his policies and that of his acolyte, especially that of his acolyte Ruth Richardson, were biting. It was in the period of the very end of the 1980s and through the 1990s that that gap opened up, and it was when his policies, when his approach was at its height, especially in the early 1990s, Mr. Speaker, when Ruth Richardson was implementing the things that Roger Douglas wanted to do and wasn't allowed to do. That is when the gap opened up between New Zealand and Australia, and he should take some responsibility for it, rather than trying to develop again the policies that would make it worse. Because what he went to sleep for about a decade, Rumpelstiltskin did, and when he woke up, he found that unemployment was down. He found that early childhood education was working well. He found that working for families meant that a number of families that have been below the poverty line were above the poverty line. And he woke up and said, I don't like it. I don't like it. There's not enough pressure on the poor. Put some more pressure on the poor. And that was the approach that Sir Roger Douglas did when he woke up from his decade of sleep away from the political world. Mr. Speaker, this is a disgraceful budget. And I want to invite people to have a good look at that table. Have a very good look at that table on page A2 of the Dominion. Forget the headline, look at the numbers. And I ask people to think carefully about what happens when you apply 5.9% instead of 2.2%. The member wants someone to read her the headline. The member for Taupo would like someone to read her the headline from the paper. I'll do better. I will tell her that people on $120,000 a year, will not get. Well, no, I'm on significantly more than that, Mr. Quinn. Enough is the answer to that. People on $120,000 a year, when you apply 5.9% instead of the 2%, because 5.9% is going to be the inflation rate, they are no better off. They are no better off at $120,000 a year when you apply the 5.9% inflation that Treasury says is going to happen. What does that mean? That's sort of like a cut-over point. What does that mean? Does that mean all the people below are better off? No, it doesn't. It means all the people below are worse off. So every family in New Zealand that is earning $120,000 or less is going to be poorer in 12 months than they are now. And I say to members opposite, how are they going to feel about that in November or August next year when they go to the election? When we have the charts for inflation being higher than they've been any time since Roger Douglas was the Minister of Finance. Higher than they've been any time. There's no debate about it. The Treasury figures never been that close. Roger Douglas has the record, the recent times record for inflation in New Zealand. That's right. And it won't be broken. We won't get to Sir Roger's level, but it will be the highest level of inflation since the mid-1980s, since the GST first came in New Zealand, 5.9%, about double the rate of inflation that they inherited, or slightly more than double of the rate of inflation, with unemployment at about 3 times the level that it was. And I ask members opposite, what are they going to think about that, explaining that to their constituents, how they've done this big tax deal, but their constituents are going to be worse off. And then, Mr. Chairman, what is going to happen as far as Mr. Chairman.
Call David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair, I just want to touch on a point that was brought up by Michael Woodhouse about the differential between Australia and New Zealand. The fact that our taxes have gone down are going to somehow attract back, in floods, people from Australia back here. Well, the reality is, Mr. Woodhouse, that in Australia they have GST at 10%, not at 15%. And if you think that people are going to come running back for the $3 or $4 or $5 that they've got as a result of this budget, think again. Inflation at 6%. You haven't factored in ACC going up, the tobacco tax, the power price rises. And if you happen to be unfortunate enough to live in Auckland, the funding of the debacle, which is the super city, nobody is going to be killed in the rush of people coming through Auckland Airport back from Australia. They will be coming back for better wages when we lift our productivity, and this budget does not do anything to lift our productivity. The way you lift productivity is to encourage companies to invest and to be innovative. So look at Australia. What have they done in innovation in the past year? They increased their R&D spend by 25%. They upped their tax credits for innovative companies and gave a tax credit of 40%. What did we do in this budget? And I'm really pleased that the Minister is here in the House today to hear this. What we did, we announced this a part of the budget early because of its importance, according to the Prime Minister. What we did was we increased a year our budget in R&D by $56 million. Most of that goes into grants and vouchers to business. So what do businesses have to do? Businesses actually now have to get on their hands and knees, and they come to the government and they say, please give me a grant for R&D. Please give me a grant for R&D. And a bureaucrat sits there and says yes to this person and no to this person. Who benefits? Not the small innovative companies that are out there. And I happen to believe, Mr. Matt, that those people that put their butts on the line, who mortgage their houses, who borrow from their friends and their family in order to get a good idea out there to market, they deserve a break. And that's what the Labor government did. That's what the Labor government did in their term of office. They gave them a 15% tax credit. A 15% tax credit. What the businesses have to do under this government is they have to go on their knees to a bureaucrat who will assess their case and then possibly give them a grant at that point. Imagine the bureaucracy, the transaction costs, and the sheer frustration of small companies having to go through that ordeal. Our business R&D is 1/3 of the OECD average. What does this government do to lift that? Zero. It increases the state contribution to R&D by 3%. 3%. But it does not do anything to our business R&D shift. If you put the tax credit back, Mr. Matt, if you acknowledge that that was the best way to do things, if you put that back, we would have doubled the R&D. We would have doubled the R&D in businesses that businesses are doing. This is the biggest scam for businesses. The biggest scam for businesses, and it really upsets me, I have to say. I mean, John Wally turned around and said that this budget's contribution to R&D is a pale shadow of what the former government put in place. It's not only that, Mr. Speaker. It's half of what the Labor government had in place. It's also half of what that government promised in 2008. So all the good news around announcing this early, ultimately was only half of what they were going to contribute when in 2008. Another broken promise, Mr. Matt. And we must sit there and feel dreadfully uncomfortable about the fact about the fact that you have only given half of what you promised. Not only that, when you start going through the figures,